Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Monday, July the 14th. And welcome to our commentary. Well, a couple of big stories today that developed in the afternoon. The first one is the meeting that President Trump had with the General Secretary of NATO, where NATO has agreed, I guess, to purchase or we're selling some weapons to NATO, and then they're going to be the different countries are going to be passing those weapons to Ukraine, and we'll see how that works out. And then, of course, also President Trump pretty much gave Putin a 60-day ultimatum and say, hey, unless we can do something in 60 days, I'm going to start taking some pretty tough economic sanctions against you. How effective economic sanctions are going to be, it's always hard to tell. Because when you're dealing with a dictator like Putin, who doesn't care one bit about the well-being of his people, he doesn't care about sanctions. So we'll see. We'll see. Unless the sanctions hit him directly. And that could be part of the solution, maybe money in banks and all of that. But the reality is that this situation in Ukraine is probably going to get more complicated before it gets any better. And I'm glad to see that NATO is getting more involved because they're much closer to it than we are. I mean, we're over here. Ukraine's over there. And those countries in Europe have to be very concerned about an aggressive Russia much more than we can be over here. So hopefully giving these weapons to these countries and taking tougher economic sanctions against Putin, that may just be the trick for the time being. For a good review of the situation in Ukraine, I would encourage you to check the video right before this one. We spoke with Richard Baer Sunday night. Richard is one of the founders of American Thinker, and he spoke in great detail about Ukraine and what some of the options are. And then the reality is, that it's probably going to get a little more complicated before it gets any better. Both sides are under a lot of pressure, not just Russia. Ukraine is under a lot of pressure. They're taking a big hit. I mean, they're losing a lot of people. So is Russia. And that's, I think, maybe both sides will get tired of fighting. Maybe that's where we're going here. But it's going to get a little bit more complicated, I suppose, before it gets any better. And again, I have always sympathized with the people of Ukraine. They're the ones who were invaded, and they have every right to defend themselves. But, it's Ukraine versus Russia, and that's a bit of a mismatch, to say the least. So we'll keep an eye on that situation. Another huge story today, and that is the Supreme Court. You may remember a few weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago, that President Trump signed an executive order to lay off some people over the Department of Education. A district judge stopped it, and now the Supreme Court has given President Trump the authority to go ahead and lay off those people. You're talking about 1,400, 1,500 people in the Department of Education. It's a huge hit for the Department of Education, a department that President Trump has promised to close. Frankly, I remember when the department was founded, I never understood why we needed a federal Department of Education when education is a local matter, a state matter. Never understood why, we had to have a Department of Education. So I'm glad that President Trump has taken these moves, and I hope that we see more and more of the Department of Education dismantle so that those dollars and, frankly, those powers go back to the states. Now, here in Texas, we have school choice. A lot of states are moving in that direction, and that's where we should be going. So a good victory today for President Trump in the courts, and a huge victory, I believe, for parents and for states like Texas and many others who are lining up to do school choice. There was a huge story. Today about the Autopen, President Biden's Autopen. This goes back to a New York Times interview that they did with President Biden, where President Biden kind of admitted that many times he was signing, let's say a pardon for a lot of different people, and that he would say, look, these are the standards, this is what I want. and then the staff would go ahead and process the pardons. And even the chief of staff admitted that he or she, I don't remember who it was, actually was advising people to go ahead and use the Autopen on these pardons. He was doing a lot of them. Now, some of these were not pardons, actually. They were clemencies and commutations. But on some of the pardons, apparently the Autopen was being used. Now, President Biden said to the New York Times in this interview that he was aware of everything, and maybe he was. But a lot of people like me have my doubts that he really was. And I think it becomes a question of what we expect from the President of the United States when he's pardoning somebody. I would hope that presidents of the United States who have the authority to pardon, I'm not questioning his authority to pardon, nor do I think I think it's a good idea that the president can pardon and offer maybe some type of commutation. I think that's a good idea that the president has that power. There's a reason for that. But I also think he should be signing them directly, particularly pardons. Particularly pardons as controversial as some of the ones he issued for the January 6th committee. I mean, those people had not been tried or charged of anything yet. Maybe they will be, I don't know. But they were not charged with anything, and yet he was giving them preemptive pardons, I guess. The same with his family. They were being given preemptive pardon. I don't know what he was expecting was going to happen to them, but these people were getting preemptive pardons. Now, he says he was aware of all of it. But frankly, there are many of us who question that. And we don't question that because we want to be unkind to President Biden. We question that because we were watching him. We were watching him. There's that famous story that happened on the 18th of January where now President Biden was still president, and Speaker Johnson had just been reconfirmed as speaker. He goes to Washington, D.C., I guess to meet with President Biden. And he said, Mr. President, why did you sign that executive order on natural gas? And President Biden said, I didn't do that. And Speaker Johnson said, yes, you did. Here's I don't know if he actually showed him the executive order, but he said, no, I didn't do that. And I think that's why for many of us, we're not sure if he actually signed a lot of these things. And when your staff is out there, pumping the Autopen to sign a bunch of commutations and potentially pardons, I don't think that's a good practice. Now, let me caution everybody out there. I don't think any of this is going to be reversed. I really don't. Because I don't know that you can reverse it. I think once the signature is there, you would have to go to the Supreme Court and challenge it in the Supreme Court eventually, and that could take a long time to do that. But I do believe that everybody who got a pardon from President Biden, whether it's Dr. Fauci or his son or everybody else, is always going to have a cloud over their name and over this pardon. Because, I think a lot of people are going to wonder if in fact, it was a legitimate pardon, whether he signed it or not. I don't know. But I think that's going to be the question. And this article that came out in the New York Times, I think raised a lot more questions than answers. But again, I don't think that anything's going to happen. There will be investigations in the Congress. That's fine. But I don't think they're going to be able to reverse anything because I just don't know how you do it. I don't know what the mechanism is for reversing a presidential pardon. Once they're issued, they're gone. But in this particular case, I think that the lesson should be learned that a president should not be using an Autopen to sign a pardon. And hopefully that is a lesson that we learn from now on. I've got a post over at the American Thinker today talking about Governor Newsom in California. And the fact that he is, or I've got a post coming out, I should say, tomorrow on Governor Newsom. And the fact that I think that what we just witnessed in California, where there was a cannabis farm that was raided and a bunch of people were picked up, including some minors, I think that's going to change the conversation about sanctuary cities in the country, because it's very difficult to defend what we just saw in California, particularly with these minors. So hopefully, this is the kind of conversation we need to have in the country to eliminate these sanctuary cities and point out the reality that if you allow illegal immigration, you're opening the door to all of these other things that come with illegal immigration. The idea that you have criminals using your cities as sanctuaries, as we've seen in California and other places. And then, of course, in this case, where you have a business using minors, 14-year-old kids, to work at a cannabis farm. I don't know. I just don't think that's a very healthy idea for a country. And probably, I would think, a violation of child labor laws. I would think it is in California and on the federal level. Well, today, July 13th, we remember President Ford, who was born on this day. He passed away in 2006. President Ford was the 38th president of the United States. He was between Nixon and Carter. And I suppose a lot of people don't remember him, particularly. I mean, if you don't remember Carter, you're not going to remember President Ford. For my generation and those of us who remember that time, President Ford came in at a very difficult time. Nixon had resigned, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the country. And he provided a certain cool, calm, and collected personality that I think we needed at the time. He was defeated by Jimmy Carter in 1976. I voted for Ford in 1976. I thought Ford was better than Carter, but I guess I was in the minority at the time. But President Ford, I think, went down in history, even though it was a very short administration and in some ways not consequential in terms of things that happened. But the fact that he came in right after President Nixon had resigned and had that integrity and the cool and calm and collected personality that I think the country needed after the Watergate scandal is something that I believe history will appreciate. And I think he gets that credit from historians. Unfortunately, most of the people today were probably not born or just don't remember his presidency and how valuable he was, I think, to the institution of the presidency, coming in when he did and stabilizing the country the way he did. So we remember President Ford on this day, born on this day in 1913. Thank you for listening. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye, everybody.